Looking out and seeing daylight out there. Not so dark. We are going to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 29. 1 Samuel 29, we're kind of dealing with some parallel stories here the last couple of weeks. We've been talking about David on his side. Last week we talked about Saul on his side. It's been a couple weeks since we talked about David, but when we last discussed him from chapter 27, we discussed some of the decisions that he made while he was discouraged. It's actually one of the first times that we've really been able to say some things that are critical of David. Not that we think that we're better than he is, not that we don't make our own poor decisions at times, but David made some decisions that were questionable. He has left the land of Israel to go and be in the land of the Philistines. He's moved his men and their families there. David has deceived the Philistines into thinking that he is on their side. He has convinced King Achish that I'm with you, right? Even to the point of potentially going to war with Israel, right? Chapter 28, verse 1 and 2 talked about how the Philistines gathered their armies together for war, and Achish said to David, "Know thou assuredly that thou shalt go out with me to battle, thou and thy men." And so we were left with the question, when we were in chapter 28, the first couple verses. Last week was about Saul, but we wondered, is David really going to fight against Israel? That's what we get. We get an answer to that tonight. Now, it's not necessarily the answer that you might think, or at least the answer doesn't come about the way that you might think. But think about that question. What do you think David will do? Is David going to turn against Israel? Is David playing the Philistines for fools, and he's going to turn on them? Chapter 29, verse number 1. Let's talk about David and the Philistines. Number 1, David and the Philistines. Verse 1 says, "Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, and the Israelites pitched by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines passed on by hundreds and by thousands. But David and his men passed on in the rearward with Achish." David and his men back with the king toward the back of the pack here. Verse 3, it says, "Then said the princes of the Philistines, What do these Hebrews here? And Achish said unto the princes of the Philistines, Is not this David, the servant of Saul the king of Israel, which hath been with me these days, or these years? And I have found no fault in him since he fell unto me unto this day." When the Philistines are lining up and they're getting ready for battle, this kind of seems odd to them, right? Well, we're getting ready to go fight against Israel. Why are these Hebrews here? Why are David and his men here? They question that. This seems odd to them. It seemed odd to them that some of the Jews had turned against their brethren. The king says, no, you don't understand. David has turned. David used to be the servant of Saul, but he's been with me now for these days or these years. That talks about how long David's lingered. And I have found no fault in him. That is, at least at this time, it's a small indictment on David. That Achish has found nothing wrong with him. You wouldn't think that a Philistine could say that about a faithful hero like David. Verse number 4. "And the princes of the Philistines were wroth with him. And the princes of the Philistines said unto him, Make this fellow return, that he may go again to his place which thou hast appointed him, and let him not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he be an adversary to us. For wherewith should he reconcile himself to his master? Should it not be with the heads of these men?" These Philistine princes, these Philistine lords get together and they say, no, we aren't having this. We can't trust this guy. David, here's what's going to happen. We're going to get in the heat of this battle, And we know how this plays out. David is going to turn on us. He's going to try to get himself back in Saul's good graces. He's going to try to reconcile himself to his king, and he's going to do it with our heads. And these Philistine princes look at David and his men, and they talk to their king and say, no, send him back. Send him home. Send him to the place that you gave him, whatever. We don't want to go to battle. They are convinced David's going to turn on them. They are convinced that David is playing them for fools, and the time is going to come shortly that David kills them. Verse number 5, it says, is not this David, of whom they sang one to another in dances, saying, Saul slew his thousands, and David his 10,000s. You see, they remember. This is the same guy that was celebrated in Israel for all the thousands of Philistines that he killed, that his tens of thousands. This is the guy, we're supposed to trust him. We're supposed to go to battle with him after all that he's done. They remember, and they're like, no, we're not having this. We are not going to battle with David. The Philistines don't want him. So verse number 6, then Achish called David and said unto him, surely as the Lord liveth, thou hast been upright, and thy going out and thy coming in with me in the host is good in my sight. For I have not found evil to this day. Nevertheless, the Lord's favor thee not. Wherefore now return and go in peace, that thou displease not the lords of the Philistines. So King Achish says, listen, it's not you and it's not me. You and I are on the same page, David. I trust you, but the rest of these Philistine lords, they don't trust you. And lest I disappoint the whole army, you and your 600 men, you're just going to have to go. So King Achish tells David, we're going to do this without you. We are going to do this without your help. Verse number 8, David says to Achish, but what have I done? And what hast thou found in thy servant so long as I have been with thee unto this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Did I do something? Why don't you trust me? Why won't you take me into this battle? David really seems intent on turning against Israel and helping the Philistines fight against them when the king says, we're not going to use you this time. What do you mean? What did I do? Why are you not? And the king answers in verse 9, Achish answered and said to David, I know that thou art good in my sight. It's not you, it's not me. I believe you. I trust you. In fact, he says, as an angel of God. Notwithstanding, the princes of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. Wherefore now rise up early in the morning with thy master's servants that are come up with thee. And as soon as ye be up early in the morning and have light, depart. So David and his men rose up early to depart in the morning, to return into the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. The king would have used David. The king of the Philistines would have used David in his battle against Israel. But the Philistine princes wouldn't have it, and so they send him home. And according to these verses, David returns home to Ziklag. And I asked a question a couple weeks ago, and I asked a question at the beginning of this lesson. What did we think would happen? Would David turn against Israel? Would David fight against Israel? Would David join battle with the Philistines against Saul? And the answer, we don't know. We don't know. Would David have fought with Israel? Would David have played the Philistines for fools and got in the heat of that battle and turned on the Philistines and fought against them? We don't get that answer. That answer was taken out of David's hands. It is good to know that in God's providence, there are times that maybe you are walking along a certain path and God just intervenes and says, I've seen enough. That's enough. And we don't actually get to see what David really would have done. God cuts off the story there before we get an answer. Now, from David's words, it sounds like he was convinced that he was going to go and he was going to join with the Philistines and fight against Israel. The Philistine princes were convinced that, nope, David's going to turn on us. As soon as we get in the battle, he's going to try to reconcile himself to Saul, and he is going to turn on us. One of them is probably right, but we don't actually get to find out that answer. God spared David from making a decision that he may have later regretted. He's just going to take that choice away from him. And this is encouraging for us, right? Because I think sometimes we pray that way for people. We see people, David has made, this is some of the first times, like we've said, we've been critical of him. He's made a couple of poor decisions here. He's left the land of Israel to go to the Philistines. He's been a little deceptive. He's done some things that we don't really think were wise or were great decisions. He's on a path that we don't think is wise. And there are times that we see people on a path maybe that we don't think is wise. And sometimes the only thing that we know how to pray is, Lord, I don't even know if they know what they're doing to themselves. Lord, if you could intervene and just put something in their way to stop them. Lord, just you'll have to intervene. You'll have to do something, because the path that they're on, the decisions that they're making. And I realize David made these decisions from a time of deep discouragement, from a time of anxiety and worry and depression. But if he turns on Israel, he may never live that one down, right? He may regret that for the rest of his life. And God spared him that. You say, well, I'm with the Philistines. I don't know if he would have gone through it or not. But you don't know that. You don't know that. He's already left the land of Israel once. He's already gathered his men. And when the king said, we're going to send you back home, David is actually like, well, why? Why can't I join the fight? Why are you sending me home? You have every reason to believe from David's mouth that he might actually do this thing until the Lord intervenes and doesn't give us an answer. We don't know what David would have done, because God steps in and says, nope, that's enough. And you know what? Sometimes when we look at people and maybe a path that they're on that we don't think is wise, or maybe people are making poor decisions, sometimes you just got to pray that. Lord, just whatever path they're on, just throw some stumbling blocks in their way. Just take some decisions out of their hands. Make some decisions for them. God did that here. God in his providence does not allow us to see what David might actually have done, because enough Philistine princes threw up their hands and said, nope, we are against this. We don't want him with us. And it's a blessing to know that God in his providence at times steps in. And sometimes he can intervene and keep people from making decisions that they'll regret. Taking a bad decision or taking a bad set of circumstances and making them worse. He can do that, right? He can step in and intervene and stop the bleeding and cut off the bad decisions. And it's a good thing here. I asked the question, would David really join with the Philistines and fight Israel? And now I think I'm actually almost glad that I don't get the answer. I don't know what he would have done, because God says, no, I've seen enough. And it's time for David to go home. Now, number 2, let's talk about David and Ziklag. That's where we come to chapter 30. Because though God had spared him from making that decision in chapter 29, chapter 30 deals with the reality of the decisions David had made up to that point. The decisions David had made, chapter 30 kind of shows us some of the consequences of those. Verse number 1, it says, and it came to pass, when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the 3rd day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag, and burned it with fire. This is one of the outcomes of the poor decisions that David had made, right? Now, ultimately, he doesn't join in a battle against the Israelites, right? That decision was taken out of his hands. The Philistines' lords made it. They sent him back. But David's been gone a while, him and his men. And he's left in his joining with the army, in his going toward the front lines and him joining up with the army of the Philistines, he and his men have left their home. They have left Ziklag, and they've left it vulnerable. And while David and his men are gone, the Bible tells us that the Amalekites attack, and they burn the city with fire. It says here in verse number 2, and had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away and went on their way. So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captives. We've talked about this a little bit, right? Just because of the connection of the books of Samuel as they record David's life, and then you make the connection with some of the Psalms that he wrote. There's a lot of emotion that you just got to sit and chew on, right? And you can only imagine some of the whirlwind emotions that these men are going through, right? First, the relief, right? These guys almost stepped into the midst of a battle with their own countrymen. David and his 600 men almost joined in a battle against Saul and Israel. They were spared that decision, and the Philistines sent them home. And you can imagine the sense just of relief. You know, man, were we really going to do that? Had it really gotten that far? Man. And then the relief. And then the sense of happiness, right? Man, okay, we're going home. We get to go home. We get to see our families. We get to see our wives. We get to see our children. We've been on the road. We've been staring down the face of a battle, and now we actually get to go home, right? And the joy and the happiness. Man, if you've ever seen the videos of soldiers that return from duty, just the joy that they have and that their families have when they're reunited and all of those things, just tremendous. But then that joy and that happiness quickly turns as they make their march home, and then they see the smoke billowing up from Ziklag. And their joy quickly starts to turn to fear as they realize that their city is being burned. Their city has been burned. And when they get there, they find, according to verse number 3, that their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captive. And you don't get to see it. It's not mentioned in those verses, but you can only imagine, that whirlwind of emotion that these men have gone through in the last however many days. And it finally catches up with them in verse number 4. It says, and David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept until they had no more power to weep. And maybe you've had that. I don't know that, some of you younger ones have. Maybe some of the adults here have been through situations that they could explain to you that are so emotional. They're so pressing upon your mind, upon your soul, that eventually you're crying, but there's no tears that come, right? You have wept so much, you have agonized over it that the feeling is still there, but like the mouth is dry, there's nothing left to say, there's no tears that can come anymore. And that's how we are pictured here. David and his men, they have wept so much that there's no more power in them to weep. They have cried, these battle-hardened, these war-hardened men have now wept like babies and wept until they can't weep anymore. It says in verse 5, David's 2 wives were taken captives. Right? David's decisions didn't just impact others. This is something he has to now feel in his own home. It says that it was Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him. You can imagine that there were a number of men in that crowd that were ready, like, this is David's fault. They come back and they see their city burned. They see that their wives and their sons and their daughters have been taken captive. And they look over at David, and then their anger starts to come in. Like, this is David's fault. If David hadn't gotten all goody-goody and buddy-buddy with the king of the Philistines and drug us off to battle, a battle we didn't even get to fight in, and you know what? Fingers get started pointing, And you know, it was stupid of us to leave anyway. Why would we have fought against Israel? And the emotions just continued to go, and they build and they boil. And you know what? We might be better off without David, actually. And there were some men that spake of stoning him. Can you believe that? These men that once rallied to David when, in his times of heartache and his times of discouragement, slowly David has amassed a number of loyal and faithful followers, men who were mighty and would follow him to death in battle. Now, they're ready to turn on him. Some of them are ready to stone him because the soul of the people was grieved. Okay, and don't misunderstand the depth of that, right? Here you've got people that are hurt so deeply. They are trying to find some kind of release, and the only release that some of them can come up with is, this is David's fault and he has to pay for this. Every man for his sons and for his daughters, but David encouraged himself in the Lord. What it says there is that it didn't say a couple of chapters ago, but it does show it now. It has taken a lot to bring David to this place, right? David has made a few poor decisions. We discussed that. David has been spared some of the outcome of those decisions, but here's an outcome that he wasn't spared. His decision to linger longer in the area of the Philistines and build up that city there and build up that region with his families, and then to take his men and leave so that he could join battle against Israel, that has left his people vulnerable. David is... Listen, God may spare you some of the outcomes of poor decisions, but there are some things that are reality, right? This is what happened. David, it's kind of his fault. I realize the men in their anger and their finger pointing want to take vengeance against David, and a few of them want to stone him. They're not entirely wrong. It's kind of David's fault. And yet David now does something that it says that he didn't do or doesn't mention back in chapter 28 and chapter 27, where he encourages himself in the Lord. David finally gets to a place about as low as you can go, where even the 600 men that had been with him through all of this, through all the hard times, through all the discouragement, he at least had that core, right? Well, as some of those even maybe start to turn, David is distressed beyond imagine. But here in this moment, David's heart and mind are renewed to the idea of God being his strength. And you have to have that. In times of deep discouragement, in times of lowliness, when everything could potentially seem against you, it's then that we're encouraged to exercise our faith in God, to remember God's promises, to remember his past deliverances, to remember his calling. David has gotten now to about as low as you can go. And it seems right now like, okay, it's basically down to David and the Lord, right, as his only help. And maybe that's what David needed. And to have that renewed encouragement, that renewed faith back in the Lord. Because according to verse number 7, it says, David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, I pray thee, bring me hither the ephod. The first thing that he wants to do is make an inquiry of the Lord about what he should do. Abiathar brought thither the ephod to David, and David inquired at the Lord, saying, should I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, pursue, for thou shalt overtake them, and without fail recover all. And that's a great encouragement, right, that comes from the Lord, that yes, go get your people back. And you'll recover them. You'll recover them completely. You'll recover all. So David went, he and the 600 men that were with him, and came to the brook Bezor, where those that were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 abode behind, which were so faint that they could not go over the brook Bezor. I'm telling you what, emotional weariness is real. And you've got 200 men here at a day. Now, I know the number 200 doesn't mean much to us. Where you have to talk about what that means is in comparison to the whole, right? It's 200 out of 600. You're talking about a third of the men that he had, right? If you can imagine you were going to go to battle with a group, and it doesn't even matter what the numbers are, but then I tell you, by the way, a third of them are they're tired, they're weary, they don't have the strength to go on any further and to help you. That's a lot of people. So he leaves them there, weary and faint, by the brook. And then they meet someone. In verse 11, they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David and gave him bread, and he did eat. And they gave him water to drink, or gave him drink water. And they gave him a piece of a cake of figs, 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit came again to him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk any water 3 days and 3 nights. And David said unto him, To whom belongest thou, and whence art thou? Where are you from? He said, I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite. And my master left me because 3 days agone I fell sick. We made an invasion upon the south of the Cherethites, and upon the coast which belongeth to Judah, and upon the south of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And that's where it sets in. This was the group that had actually attacked them. This was a previous servant of the one that had attacked them. And this Egyptian servant apparently had gotten sickly, and the Amalekite owner or master left him by the side of the road, I guess, to die. There were a few comments. There were a few commentaries that talk about the Amalekites, and because the Amalekites didn't kill any of the women and children, that maybe they were merciful. The Amalekites had plans for the women and children that they took, and the episode here with this servant lets you know there's not a heart of mercy in these Amalekites. And here's one that gets sick, and they just leave him by the side of the road to die. But when he hears about Ziklag, David realizes this is the group he's hunting. And so verse 15, David said unto him, Canst thou bring me down to this company? And he said, Swear unto me by God that thou wilt neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring thee down to this company. So the Egyptian's going to help them. The Egyptian is going to help them find these Amalekites. Now, number 3, lastly, let's talk about the recovery. The recovery. Verse number 16, it says, And when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread upon all the earth, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil that they had taken out of the land of the Philistines and out of the land of Judah. Now this celebration here, just so you know, you are not to read into this that the Amalekites are necessarily this big, rough and tough and bad group, right? It doesn't take much to attack Ziklag when there's nothing but women and children there. When all the men have gone off to war to fight against David, now here they are celebrating, and they're dancing, and they're eating and drinking, and they've made like they've won some great battle and taken this great spoil. You attacked a city that didn't have any defense. You attacked a city that didn't have any men left to defend it. Congratulations. Verse 17, And David smote them from the twilight even unto the evening of the next day. And there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men, which rode upon camels and fled. Those that couldn't get to a getaway vehicle, those that couldn't get to a camel, they were killed. And David took out his vengeance here on these Amalekites. Verse 18 says that David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives. And there was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither spoil nor anything that they had taken to them. David recovered all. This is almost unheard of, and it's actually almost unbelievable, right? That all of them? You're telling me that they were able to recover every woman, son, and daughter, not just recover all the people, recover all the stuff? Like they got everything back? Well, that was what God had promised, wasn't it? That was what God had said, that thou without fail would recover all. And we see the promise fulfilled there. We see that David and his men were able to recover everything. That's amazing, right? You would not think that that was even possible, right? You're telling me in a battle there was no casualty on the Israelite side? That is amazing, right? You don't see battles really talked about in the Bible that way. You read about, larger numbers, right? But you don't, when you read about a battle, in the Old Testament that Israel won, right? Where they defeated the Amalekites or they defeated the Canaanites. You're not to assume that those battles never had any casualties, right? Israel never lost any men fighting in battle or fighting in war. No, you're not to assume that. And yet here we're actually told that. We're told no casualty. They recovered everything. Just unheard of. And yet it was God's promise fulfilled. Verse 20, David took all the flocks and the herds which they drave before those other cattle and said, "This is David's spoil." And David came to the 200 men, which were so faint that they could not follow David, whom they had made also to abide at the brook Bezor. And they went forth to meet David and to meet the people that were with him. And when David came near to the people, he saluted them. David returns back, the 200 men that had been left behind because of their weariness, because of their lack of strength and ability to continue on. David comes back, and here he comes loaded, right? The caravan is full. They've actually got more than they ever lost, more than they left, more than they lost at Ziklag, because they've got some of the Amalekite spoil now. And it says in verse 22, "Then answered all the wicked men and men of Belial, of those that went with David, and said, Because they went not with us, we will not give them aught of the spoil that we have recovered, save every man his wife and his children, that they may lead them away and depart." There's a few things about this verse. David had some loyal followers. You are not to interpret into that all of those followers were always godly faithful. They might have been faithful to David. A better term might be patriotic, some of these, because there were some that followed David that the Bible says they were wicked men. Now, there were some mighty men of valor. There were some mighty, trustworthy, and faithful, and loyal, and men that David could trust and rely on. And there were some that followed David for a patriot's cause. There were some that followed David because they were tired. What did the Bible say? That David, some of them that had rallied to David, those that had become indebted, those that had become distressed. David did end up with some stragglers that were unhappy with the situation in Israel. Some of those that followed him weren't the most moral, weren't the greatest, most faithful, godly men. Maybe those were the ones that were first to turn on him and want to stone him. We don't know. But they get back and they're like, y'all didn't even help. They see the 200 that were left by the brookside and they get bitter, right? They get really mad because here we jeoparded ourselves and we went and rescued. We actually went and did your work. We went and actually rescued your families and you didn't help. And the very prospect of some of the things that they went and rescued actually belong to the guys that were there by the brookside, and they don't even want to return it. They don't even want to share with these. It says there in verse 22, "Because they went not with us, we will not give them aught of the spoil that we have recovered. Save to every man his wife and his children, that they may lead them away and depart." David, those 200 that didn't go and join the battle, give them their wives, give them their children, and tell them to get out of here. They're less than helpful. They didn't help at all. They sat back here, and they didn't help us in this battle at all. And well, I tell you what, it doesn't take much to get some people to turn against people, right? Here you got men that okay, they're wicked. They're sons of Belial. What do you think is probably some of their motivating factor? Yeah, I'm sure they loved their families. They wanted to get their families back. But the prospect of sharing the spoil that they worked hard for, I fought for that. You didn't fight for that. And they're not going to share. They don't want to share, right? Well, verse 23, "Then said David, Ye shall not do so, my brethren. with that which the Lord hath given us, who hath preserved us, and delivered the company that came against us into our hand. I like the way David talks there, right? Because David immediately points it back to, like, you probably shouldn't just assume that you went and made this happen. God delivered this to us. It says that he preserved us. He delivered the company that came to us. The Lord had given us this spoil. You know, these men have come back talking about all that they've achieved and all that they've earned and all that they worked for and how these others didn't. And David's like, oh, hold on a minute now. You know, I'm pretty sure it was the Lord that gave us this victory. We're not going to do this, okay? We are not going to take this great victory that God gave us and get selfish about this and kind of divide up our own portions here. Verse 24, for who will hearken unto you in this matter? But as his part is that goeth down to the battle, so shall his part be that tarrieth by the stuff. They shall part alike. Now, what does it mean that they stayed by the stuff? Well, there were some supplies. There was some equipment. There would have been some things that these men would have had that they left. They left in the watch of those 200 that couldn't go. So 400 are going to battle. You know what those 200 did? No, they couldn't go to battle, but they were able to, in a sense, lessen some of the burden. They were able to lessen some of the things that would have needed to be carried and watched over, and they were able to assemble there together by the brook. No, they didn't have much strength. No, that there wasn't much they could do in a battle sense, but they could watch over what they could. They could take care of the stuff. They could watch over and lessen some of the burdens, keep the others from having to carry so much, do so much. And David says, I'm going to count that. I'm going to count that as participating, right? Sometimes service, is found in the support. And those that supported the effort were just as helpful and just as loyal. David doesn't view these men as less loyal. David doesn't view these men as trying to get out of battle or trying to get away from a fight. These were men that, had stood with David. These were men that were ready to follow David, apparently right against Israel, their own brethren. And they just got weary, and they just couldn't anymore. There were some that were emotionally stricken and weak and weary and could not go on any further. And David says, we're not doing that. We're not going to do that to them. And so he says, his part is that goeth down to the battle, so shall his part be that tarrieth by the stuff. Your inability to do one thing doesn't mean you can't do something else, okay? You are not to read into this that these men hung out by the brook through all this battle. No, they had things that they were watching over. They had things they were protecting. There was what they could do, okay? Maybe we can't all do the same thing. And maybe there are front lines that some of us are on and some of you are on. And there's other things that some others might have to do in the background in more of a supporting role. Those things are important. I remember the story of Sheila Winnan when we were at Emmanuel Baptist there in Centerville, Ohio, and we were having a Tuesday night, door knocking. We were going out in the community just to visit. And Sheila was disabled, and she was in a wheelchair, obviously not physically having the ability to go door to door with any kind of efficiency to keep up or anything like that. She said something, and I think it just about, tore up everybody in the church, where she said, well, I can't go door knocking, but if anybody wants to go, I'll stay back at the church and watch the kids. And you know what? I think there's a soul winner's crown for that too. You telling me that if she freed somebody up to go on visitation that maybe wouldn't have been able to without a babysitter, without some help, without some support there, you're telling me there's not reward for that? You're telling me that there's not a great blessing in someone doing what they could do? And David saw that in these men. And he said, we're not going to do this to these men. Those that went and those that didn't, but they supported, everybody gets one part alike. And it was so from that day forward that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel unto this day. And when David came to Ziklag, he sent of the spoil unto the elders of Judah. David, let's wrap up our story here. I think it's clear to see through all of this, and this chapter is going to end on a good note. David has a few fences to mend with the Israelites back in Judah, right? He had left them. There were some that maybe if they hadn't joined David's 600, there were still some that were sympathetic to him. There were some that had seen even Jonathan in Saul's own household knew, Saul's gone off the deep end. Things aren't great. But David had left. David had just up and left and went to the land of the Philistines. And nobody's seen David. Nobody's, heard from David in a year plus that he's been here in this land in Ziklag. David's got some fences to mend to get back. And so, according to verse 26, David came to Ziklag. He sent the spoil unto the elders of Judah, even to his friends, saying, Behold, a present for you of the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. This proved to them, David is still going to fight against God's enemies. David is still going to fight against Israel's enemies. David has encouraged himself in the Lord. David seems now to be on a much better path. It mentions here a number of cities, them in Bethel, Ramoth, Jatir, Eror, Sifmoth, Estimoa, to them that were in Rechal, to them which were in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, to them which were in the cities of the Kenites, Hormah, Chorashan, Atach, to them that were in Hebron, and to all the places where David himself and his men were wont to hunt. David's sending gifts back, mending fences, trying to make up. David is going to return to Israel. David is going to sit on this throne shortly. I love these passages, right? Because this is just a heavy dose of reality. This is just the way that life works. It's the way that the world works. David, back in chapter 27, he made a couple of poor decisions. Chapter 29 and 30 show us the reality of, some of those decisions had consequences, right? He left his people vulnerable. They were taken captive. And yet, we're also seeing that even in our poor decisions, sometimes God in his providence intervenes, and because he's tremendously merciful and gracious to us, sometimes he mends a lot of the damage and fixes a lot of the damage that we would have done to ourselves if we weren't careful. Would David have actually fought against Israel? We don't know. God protected him from having to make that decision. David was able to recover all that he lost plus more. We are surrounded at times by people that we believe are making poor decisions, maybe amongst our friends, our family, people that we work with, close people to us. And let's face it, there's times we're the ones making the poor decisions. All right? It's not just everybody else that makes poor decisions. I make them too. I'm thankful to know that our God is one that can be prayed to and requested that, Lord, could you intervene here? And he does. He can, and there are times that he does. And he can stop someone on their path. He can fix some of the things that they broke. Don't quit praying for people. God can help, right? David made some bad decisions. We get it. And it's easy to be critical of him. I make bad decisions too. God had a purpose for David, and God intervened so that he could get him back into a path where he could use him, where he could set him up to be the next king of Israel and begin to mend some of the fences that were broken with the decisions that he made, okay? Keep praying. Pray for people. Pray that God fix some of the bad decisions that you've made or that I've made. He can do that, all right? All right. Tell you what, let's have a word of prayer tonight, and we will be dismissed. Father, we are